Tonight at busy sites across the country, public sector workers ramp up the strike pressure.
We could have resolved things faster if they sat down with us and actually be serious.
Plus the fight to make remote work permanent. Cancon goes digital. A new law brings a legacy media idea to a streaming world.
The biggest concern right now is the actual ambiguity around the legislation.
He brought the raw and raucous to daytime and changed television forever.
You witness real human interaction, and the topic itself doesn't matter.
Remembering Jerry Springer.
This is The National with Ian Hannamansing.
Right across the country, striking public servants are trying to increase their pressure on the federal government, hoping for quicker progress at the negotiating table. Today, they took their picket lines to some very public places, like the busiest airport in the country and a major U.S. border crossing. The message to Ottawa, let's get a deal done now. The strike has been going on for more than a week, and as Sarah Levitt shows us, frustration is growing.
Under thick fog at one of Canada's busiest border crossings, striking federal workers brought in on buses marched as provincial police kept watch. They were on a side road not blocking travelers, but aiming to heap pressure on the government as the strike dragged into week 2. Wages are a major sticking point. The government is offering a 9% increase over 3 years. The union wants 13.5.
We started negotiation with our our salary. We went down twice. Government is just stretching out this strike. We could have resolved things faster if they sat down with us and actually be serious.
We will overcome!
Across the country, more strike actions brought to more busy places. At Toronto's Pearson Airport, travelers were warned to give themselves extra time, with hundreds of workers protesting outside.
Our lives have been disrupted by the federal government, and it's time for them to feel some disruptions themselves.
In New Brunswick, workers blocked trucks at a major postal sorting station. In Whitehorse, they were outside a government building. And near Quebec City's Valcartier military base, officials closed 3 schools for the day after strikers blocked roads in the area on Wednesday.
We are negotiating.
The government says it's balancing giving the workers a fair deal without burdening taxpayers.
We respect, of course, the strike, but we have to find a way to find resolution.
Federal Minister François-Philippe Champagne extended his own olive branch of sorts, greeting striking workers in his hometown of Shawinigan, where he was asked about whether back-to-work legislation could be in the cards.
No, on n'est pas là du tout.
His response, no, we're not there at all.
So, Sarah, negotiations continue. Where do things go from here?
Well, both parties are at the table, but this latest escalation from PSAC is a pressure tactic. They want the government's attention. And caught in the middle are those not involved. The people across Canada affected by this strike. Out on the picket line today, I saw workers getting support, yes, but not from everybody. One woman said she didn't have sympathy for them, that they have pensions, that they have benefits, and that's something that not everybody gets. So, Ian, it's clear that the union doesn't have unanimous support.
All right, Sarah, thank you. As Sarah explained, a wage increase is one key union demand. Another is having the option for remote work written into contracts. And as Nisha Patel explains, there are a lot of groups watching that one closely.
For these federal employees, the right to work remotely is worth striking for.
Work-life balance, it's just easier to balance everything.
Save a little bit of the commute time, that'd be really good.
For those who are also parents, it's made a world of difference.
Before this work-from-home opportunity, I was never thinking to work till my kids grow up.
Now it's become a sticking point in the negotiations between the Public Service Alliance of Canada and the federal government. The union wants the right to work remotely to be included in the collective agreement. But so far, Ottawa isn't budging.
It is a red line. It is the right of management.
The Treasury Board says work-from-home decisions should be up to bosses. The union says it knows not every job can be done from home every day, but when work from home is possible, it wants workers to have the option.
Once you embed it in a collective agreement, it's like something that can't be necessarily taken away.
Experts say the pandemic ushered in a new reality, with employees proving they can remain productive.
There's definite, I think, agreement that if you provide workers flexibility, there will be a benefit.
Other unions are also paying close attention.
This is an emerging trend. This is an emerging issue. And many companies, many provincial and territorial governments will be watching to see how this ends up.
And a win for public sector employees could create new standards.
Do you think this strike success will improve chances for other workers?
I think their fight is our fight, quite frankly. And the outcome of this fight will be setting the bar for so many workers right across this country.
Those who were on strike say they know the right would come with responsibilities.
We all understand that if we need to go into the office to get something done, we go into the office to get it done. Hands down, no questions asked.
Hopeful they'll be back to work soon, though maybe not in the office. Nisha Patel, CBC News, Toronto.
Turning to the crisis in Sudan now, where rival factions have agreed to extend a ceasefire through the weekend. Some 1,800 Canadians remain trapped there. Today, the government announced some have now been moved out.
The first Canadian evacuation flight from Sudan has taken place using a Hercules aircraft. There will be more details to share soon.
Ottawa later confirming a second flight out of Khartoum using a commercial jet. 118 people in total were flown out. Officials didn't confirm exactly how many were Canadian, but it's believed to be dozens. We got a first-hand account today of what it's like for those trying to get out. Our colleagues at Radio-Canada spoke to a Canadian woman who managed to flee to Darfur after the fighting began. Now at home near Toronto, she described her terror and her frustration with Canada's response to her pleas for help.
On the 15th of April, we just woke up with the sounds of bombing and heavy gunfire and airstrikes, and life was just hell. And then when the bombing got more fierce, then we contacted them. Then they transferred us to Ottawa, to the global office in Ottawa. And they told us just to shelter, no evacuation plan is on the ground. People were dying from the random bullets and from the bombing, and everything is dark. And we call our global office, global affair office, and they say no. They didn't say it directly, but they say we don't have any evacuation plan because the situation is volatile and insecure. Yes, it is insecure. That's why we called you. I have my godson and my goddaughter. They're from Darfur. They decided to risk their lives and just to take us there. And we took our things and then we drove there to the air base. All the other countries, they have the troops and they have civil personnel directing their citizens what to do. For us, there is nothing. We just ask, where is the Canadian? So I just went to the German troops and I asked them, can you accommodate us with you? And they said yes, just going, and they took us.
For millions of Sudanese, there's little chance of escape. The ceasefire, if it holds, may provide a brief respite from the fighting. Chris Brown shows us their dire situation.
Sudan now feels like a country on the verge of collapse. Foreigners may be getting out, but tens of millions of Sudanese have nowhere to flee. For those remaining in the capital, Khartoum, the necessities of life, water, food, and fuel, are increasingly scarce. It seems anyone with a vehicle and gas can charge extravagant amounts to take people to border areas. We just want to get away from this war, said a Syrian man who reached Port Sudan. More than 16,000 people have already crossed into Egypt, with thousands of others still hoping to. Chad, to the west, is expecting an even larger influx, and its refugee camps are already crowded. We have nothing to eat or drink, and if the rain hits us, we don't have any shelter, said this woman after a long journey. South Sudan, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, has been inundated with Sudanese arriving at its border. The country split from Sudan more than a decade ago and is crippled by drought and famine, says the UN's top official in the region.
We're redirecting some of that humanitarian assistance to those most vulnerable people at the border, providing them with food, providing them with water. Now, that is a short-term solution.
The concern is that neither of the two warring generals, one the leader of the National Army, the other of a rival paramilitary force, are really serious about peace.
I think the worry about agreeing to these ceasefires on both sides is that of resupply, and both sides taking the opportunity to strengthen themselves for another round of fighting.
The urgency of the evacuations of foreigners has given the Sudan crisis immense global attention. The fear is, once they end, concern will fade as the fighting and suffering intensifies, leaving Sudan and its neighbors to deal with a spiraling crisis on their own. Chris Brown, CBC News, London.
There are new details from police in Saskatchewan about what exactly transpired during the worst mass stabbing in Canadian history. Last September, 11 people were killed and 17 were injured on or near James Smith Cree Nation. Here's Sam Sampson with what we've learned about how it happened.
This is my sage.
To get through this week, Brian Burns, known as Buggy, needed help from loved ones lost.
Before I left, I went and visited them at the church, Bonnie and Gregory.
What did you tell them?
Just asked them to watch over me, and I wish I was home, protect you guys.
Buggy's son Gregory and wife Bonnie were among 11 murdered. Now he knows more about how they died.
Part of this presentation may be difficult for some to hear and see.
RCMP say days before the stabbings, Miles Sanderson and his brother Damien Sanderson sold cocaine in James Smith Cree Nation. At the time, both brothers were wanted men. Less than 24 hours before the stabbings, RCMP came across Damien when someone called 911 saying he'd stolen a vehicle, but they didn't recognize him from an older photo, so they didn't arrest him.
Damien told an adult female acquaintance that he and Miles, quote, have a mission to do, and that, quote, people would hear all about it in the next few hours.
RCMP say Damien stopped the first attack, prompting a fight between the brothers. Damien ran off into the bush, where he died. Initially a suspect in the killings, Damien was actually the first to be fatally wounded. Miles continued a violent rampage. He made his way to different homes by walking and stealing cars, killing and brutally assaulting as he went. He went to 2 other towns, killing another man in the process. Then he vanished. Lives lost and ruined in just under 3 hours. After almost 4 days, RCMP arrested Miles on the side of a Saskatchewan highway. Police say shortly after, he went into medical distress and died.
There was a lot of questions asked that probably won't be answered.
Daryl Burns lost his sister in the stabbings. The addictions worker hopes RCMP can address what he says are the root causes of this violence.
This tragedy is taking people's focus away from the real issue, which is the addictions, which is the oppression, the suppression that our people have faced for so many years. You know, we have to get back to that ability to love ourselves.
So, Sam, what's the response from leaders of James Smith Cree Nation today?
They say that the transparency from RCMP is great, but they still need help addressing the drug trade pervading their community. The First Nation has asked for and still wants its own police force so protection can come from within.
And what more information might be coming in the future?
There might be a lot still coming in the future, actually, Ian. There are 2 inquests from the coroner service here in Saskatchewan scheduled for January. One into overall what happened, and the second into Miles Sanderson's death while he was in police custody. We might get answers to things we didn't today, including how did police handle the situation once they were in James Smith Cree Nation. Now, in terms of a motive, we still don't have one. Police say a psychological autopsy is happening on Miles Sanderson, an attempt to dig into his past to find out why he did all of this. But they repeated the message, which we've heard for months. We may never know.
All right, Sam, thank you.
Thank you.
Support for anyone affected by this story is available. Contact Wellness Together Canada. The number is 1-866-585-0445 or text wellness to 741-741. It is free and it's confidential. To some concerning health news now in parts of this country. Tuberculosis is on the rise, another impact of the COVID pandemic. Alison Northcott shows us where it's creeping back and why.
Hey, Tina. So I just wanted to show you this.
Tina Campbell has fought tuberculosis herself and has worked in TB care for years. She's recently seen cases rise in the 33 First Nations communities she works with in northern Saskatchewan, from 19 cases in 2019 to more than 70 last year.
All of our resources, even my entire team, was deployed to assist with COVID.
Canadian health officials say the pandemic has hampered efforts to reduce and eliminate tuberculosis, a treatable disease that often affects the lungs.
And we are steadfast.
Indigenous Services Canada says contact tracing, prevention and diagnosis of TB were reduced in some areas as staff were redeployed.
All of those have contributed in some areas, either stalling of the progress made, or in some cases reversing the downward trend.
It may be that people did not seek healthcare because of the pandemic lockdowns, so we didn't diagnose them. It may be that people are mixing more.
In Manitoba, after years of declines, there was an increase in TB deaths last year.
Most of the gains we made with those 10 to 15% annual decreases were kind of lost in 2022, where we had a huge rebound.
TB has a disproportionate impact on Indigenous people, particularly among Inuit, with rates 300 times higher than the Canadian-born non-Indigenous population. Health officials say a lack of adequate housing, food insecurity, and limited healthcare access play a big role.
The good news is here they have a
Campbell sees that in First Nations communities too.
If you have one person with active TB in a 2-bedroom house with 20 people and all the windows are boarded up, it would be very likely that a lot of those people would become infected.
5 years ago, the federal government and the Inuit Tapirit Kanatami organization committed to eliminating Inuit TB by 2030. ITK says that goal is still possible, but says achieving it will require commitment, resolve, and funding from all levels of government. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
U.S. basketball star Brittany Griner spoke publicly today for the first time since her release from a Russian penal colony. She was asked how she made it through the ordeal.
I'm no stranger to hard times, so. See, you cried and you made me cry. You're going to be faced with adversities throughout your life. This was a pretty big one. But I just kind of relied on my hard work, getting through it.
Griner said she doesn't plan to play outside the United States again unless she's representing her country in the Olympics. She promised to fight for others detained, including Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, currently being held in Russia. The United Nations' universal call to end poverty and reduce inequalities is in peril. At the midway point, the report card shows more than half the world is lagging behind. David Thurton now on Ottawa's pledge today to help achieve those goals and the critics' calls for them to do more.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau urging a united front at the United Nations.
None of us is alone in this, and none of us can imagine that if we take care of ourselves, we'll make it through. That's not true anymore.
Justin Trudeau and the Barbados Prime Minister, both advocates for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, including for climate change, clean water, and ending extreme poverty by 2030, meeting today at the halfway mark for achieving those targets.
Halftime is a time for reflection, a time to summon the energy to go again.
While the leaders spoke in New York, in Ottawa, Canada's International Development Minister announced nearly $200 million over 5 years for women's rights organizations abroad.
Today's announcement is a recommitment of our government's unapologetic stance to be feminist.
It's a little bit hypocritical.
Such announcements ring hollow among some international aid advocates, who note this year's budget had nearly $1 billion foreign aid shortfall.
You can't be the champion of the developing world and then cut foreign aid by 15% for the developing world.
But Ottawa's ambassador in Washington disagrees Canada isn't doing enough.
I don't think Canada has anything to feel defensive about in terms of our participation and support internationally for development and for assistance, whether it's Haiti, Ukraine.
The United Nations warns that the window for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is slipping from our grasp. With only 12% of the targets on track, its Secretary General warns that it could become an epitaph for a world that might have been. David Thurton, CBC News, New York.
A freight train derailment in Wisconsin is being investigated tonight. At least a dozen of the train cars went off the tracks and at least 2 into the Mississippi River. Officials say there were hazardous materials on board, but that the public is not at risk. No injuries or deaths have been reported. Also in the U.S., Jerry Springer, the controversial star of daytime TV, has died.
I'm tired of
For decades, The Jerry Springer Show was one of the biggest things on daytime TV. Ostensibly a talk show, some considered it more like a circus. With Springer as ringmaster while guests grappled with outrageous dilemmas before a frenzied audience.
This is your brother.
It was huge, as popular among viewers as it was hated by critics who considered it exploitative trash.
Last Wednesday, I took her to Red Lobster, bro.
But day after day, millions tuned in for its inevitable descent into chaos. It wasn't always that way. The Jerry Springer Show actually started out as a serious program back in 1991.
Please don't deal with the Iranians, don't deal with the terrorists. President Reagan says, we really didn't trade arms for hostages.
Actually, politics came naturally to him. Before venturing into TV, Springer was a lawyer and Cincinnati city councilor and then mayor before an unsuccessful run for Ohio governor.
Tonight, Jerry Springer.
He parlayed that experience into a job doing political commentary for NBC.
That this is America, that this is the freedom we sought.
But he was also a born showman. And while he may not have invented trash TV,
is it strange you two having a threesome?
Arguably, he may have perfected it.
We had a blast. It was fun.
The show was finally canceled in 2018 after 27 seasons. Jerry Springer died of cancer at his home near Chicago. He was 79. The controversial new law forcing streaming giants to pay attention to Canadian content.
Simply asking the streamers, the Disney and Netflix that we all love to contribute to Canadian culture.
Could it change what you stream? The Prime Minister is in New York selling Canada's green tech sector.
We're not just bringing back manufacturing. We're bringing back a strong, thriving economy.
But are Canadians paying too much for it? Rosie's here with the ad issue panel.
Long time ago.
And South Korea's president shows off his musical chops.
The band, the music.
We're back in 2. Vice Media has announced a major round of layoffs. The company is canceling its flagship Vice News Tonight program, along with other cuts. Executives call the reductions painful but necessary. Vice, just the latest media company to slash its workforce. Last week, BuzzFeed dissolved its entire news department. And it's not just media companies that are making cuts. Clothing retailer Gap is laying off 1,800 employees at the corporate level after eliminating 500 jobs just last fall. The company, which owns Banana Republic and Old Navy, has seen a slump in sales over the past few years. A bill aimed at regulating digital streaming platforms in Canada has now become law. The country's broadcast regulator will now have to come up with some rules for how services like Netflix and YouTube create and promote Canadian content. As Renee Filipponi shows us, not everyone is on board.
Accordingly, the motion is adopted.
And with that vote, the much-debated Bill C-11 passed in the Senate. For the Heritage Minister, it's a big win.
The bill is very simple. It's simply asking the streamers, the Disney and Netflix that we all love to contribute to Canadian culture.
We were known in Canada for our comedy, and I think we'll see more of that.
Liz Shorten says the new regulations for streaming platforms will mean more opportunities for Canadian productions.
We're very pleased that the government has taken this bold move. We know that other countries around the world are watching, and this will be a historic day.
For years, streaming platforms like Netflix, Disney Plus, and Amazon Prime have operated in Canada outside of the regulations traditional Canadian broadcasters must follow, including Canadian content rules and funding Canadian productions. How that's going to change will now be up to the CRTC, but many critics, including Conservatives, think the law is unnecessary.
Why wouldn't we want to compete with the world? Canada can, Canadians can. Just have faith in Canadians.
Hear, hear.
Others worry the rules won't be clear enough.
So the biggest concern right now is the actual ambiguity around the legislation and the doors that are open and the doors that are not closed.
These are 5 things that make perfect sense in Canada.
Much of the controversy around the bill is about whether it would apply to user-generated content, like the videos uploaded to popular sites like TikTok. The government says no.
This has nothing to do with user-generated content. It's only about the streamers contributing to our culture.
The government will give directives to the CRTC about its vision for the bill. That will be followed by a consultation process where stakeholders can weigh in before any of the details are decided. Renee Filipponi, CBC News, Vancouver.
The LCBO, the provincial retailer for alcohol in Ontario, is set to phase out paper bags in its stores. Customers will have to bring their own or purchase a reusable bag in store. Cardboard boxes and 8-pack carriers will still be available at no cost. Company says it's part of its commitment to sustainability. No date yet for the change to take effect. After the break, Rosie is here with At Issue.
Hi, Ian. How much should the government be betting on making Canada a hub for the green energy economy? The PM's in New York today, in part to champion Canada's critical mineral supplies and sell the U.S. on further investment, but at what cost to Canadians? Chantal, Althea, and Andrew will join me to talk about that and more. Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. The Prime Minister is in New York for the next couple days to talk about climate change and women's rights, but he's also there to pitch Canada as a reliable trading partner and source of critical minerals. That pitch clearly worked with Volkswagen when it announced its first giant electric battery plant outside of Europe last week.
With this historic project, we're not just bringing back manufacturing. We're bringing back a strong, thriving economy for this community, and we're delivering a national anchor for Canada's electric vehicle supply chain.
It comes with a big price tag for Canadians, up to $13 billion in subsidies over a decade. The government says every country wanted to land this plant, and Canada won out. What does this tell us about the government's industrial policy? Let's bring everybody in. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. I should start with Andrew because I know he has strong feelings about it, but that's why I'm going to start with Althea. And just make Andrew wait for a minute. Althea, obviously the government believes that this is a bet worth making. That this is going to contribute to the future economy, that it's important to get in on the ground floor, but it does come with a big price tag. What do you make of the direction that the government is taking with this?
An enormous price tag. They have been chasing this deal for almost a year. And obviously with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which is really the reason why we've had to dole out so much money, about $13 billion to get Volkswagen to have its battery subsidiary here in Ontario. It changed the game in a way, because in order for Canada to compete with the US, because if you have an international company like this, and they have choices. If we can't play at that same level, then we basically just close the door. And the government has determined that at least in one case, they're willing to spend as much money as that company would get in the United States. But I think what's perhaps more interesting is that, you spoke about an industrial policy. Well, the industrial policy at the moment basically just seems to be a subsidy policy. You have the government spending billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes more than half of the investment is coming from the federal and provincial government just to keep certain companies in the country. That's a lot of money. We cannot obviously continue to subsidize every job in this country. So I think at some point the government needs to explain what the industrial policy actually is, because I think that's the bigger concern for kind of you and me and the outside observers who, are not necessarily benefiting from this, but are having to.
Yeah. So Andrew, what should Canadians be wondering and asking when they see this kind of deal announced?
Well, the government is betting the farm, first of all, on a future technology that may or may not be the technology of the future. There's a lot of questions about which kinds of battery technology are going to be the winners in the future, and nobody really knows at this point, but the government seems to think it knows. It's betting a vast amount of money, not just on that, but on the proposition that that industry is so all important that other industries must sacrifice labor and capital to keep it in business. The jobs that will be created or maintained in this are not going to be created out of thin air. They're going to be drawn away from other industries. This is always the way with subsidies, particularly the case when you've got full employment, as we do in Canada right now. So essentially you're saying, we've decreed as a matter of a priori certainty that this industry is the industry that should benefit and other industries should basically sacrifice to support it. I don't understand why that would be a supportable public policy. It's just simply, it's something that's sexy, it's batteries, it's electric vehicles, it's something they can point to as being the industry of the future, but it makes no sense as economic policy. It wouldn't make sense if it was $1 billion. It makes even less sense at $13 billion, which is just an absolutely astronomical sum of money.
I will just clarify that the subsidies are directly linked to the products being produced and sold. So they don't get that money. Yep. They actually have to build the plant, produce the batteries, and sell them in order to get the subsidy. Right. But just so that's clear. Chantal.
Right.
I will agree with Andrew that there is a bet involved. But the other side of that bet in the minds of many politicians, including the Premier of Ontario, is that if you don't make that bet, the Ontario manufacturing sector will eventually turn into a rust belt. I don't know if that's true or not. That's the nature of a bet. But since we're a political panel, I'll just note that judging from the silence in the House of Commons, it's a bet that the Conservatives are also willing to take.
Yeah.
And they are not making a case for not taking that bet. You asked about industrial policy. We can't have an industrial policy in a silo anymore. And Althea is right. The reason why this is happening is it's being driven by the U.S. Industrial policy. But am I ready to say we will lose that bet? I think most experts aren't even willing to go there, and I'm not an expert.
Well, let me get Andrew on that then. The fact that, that Canada felt it didn't have a choice but to try and compete with the U.S. given what it was putting on the table.
Well, we can't compete with the United States. We don't have the deep pockets they do. This could conceivably make sense in two scenarios. One is you pony up a match the American subsidy, and you do so in a way that persuades the Americans, this is madness, we better stop. Well, that's not going to happen. They're going to spend whether we spend it or not. Or if you put this subsidy in and you knock the Americans and everybody else out of the game, you get a worldwide monopoly in the good in question. So you get such extraordinary profits from it that it overwhelms that zero-sum game I was describing earlier, where you're simply robbing other industries to pay for it. Well, that's not going to pay for it either. So all we're really doing by ponying up this extraordinary sum of money is to win the right to go on subsidizing. I mean, supposedly this is supposed to end in 2034. Do you think that's likely? Has that been the record of the auto industry in the past? No. What you get by subsidizing the industry is hostages to fortune, because the industry then becomes, you can't lose it. It becomes too big to fail, and you have to keep on putting more money into it.
Well, that's the point. The auto sector has been subsidized so much. Chantal, then Althea.
Yes, but that has not necessarily been the result of the auto sector. Yes, we did bail them out in 2008 under a Conservative government, but eventually the government recuperated its money. I'm not so sure that Andrew has a crystal ball that is more certain than everyone else, and he knows that in 2034, we will see that it didn't work out. I don't know that. But I am more comfortable saying I don't know than saying I'll predict that this will be great, or I'll predict that this is the worst thing we could have ever done.
Althea, and then I'll let Andrew wrap up on his crystal ball.
The government is hoping that this is an anchor, that they may not need to dole out $15 billion to 5 other companies, but that they can now have a foothold, that they can continue to produce green cars, that the critical minerals in Northern Ontario will materialize, and they will be able to feed and continue to feed that cross-border US-Canada auto industry. Because without it, they fear that all of that investment will go to the United States, and we will not have any car manufacturers in Ontario anymore. And that's also why the government of Ontario is willing to play in that game. I think you raised an interesting point about the Conservatives. You know, on the one hand, you have the Conservative leader and some of his deputies suggesting this is way too much money. But on the other hand, this is in a Conservative riding, and you know, one former Conservative MP is now the mayor of St. Thomas, is very excited to have this money. Karen Vecchio, the local MP, was at the announcement, clearly supportive. So it's a little bit like the public sector strike, where the Conservatives in some ways are trying to have it both ways.
Last word to you, Andrew.
Suppose the worst happens, we refuse to subsidize to this extraordinary amount, and we lose the entire auto industry. Then we would be like Australia. Australia had an auto industry like ours. The industry kept on coming back to oil for more and more billions of dollars in subsidies. Eventually, the Australian government said, we're not doing this anymore. We're not going to play this game anymore. Yeah, they lost the auto industry. Has the Australian economy tanked? Has it cratered? No, it's been growing faster than ours ever since. So we don't actually have to play this game in perpetuity.
Okay, we're going to take a break right there. Good conversation. Coming up, Canada is being called on to step up its defense and security efforts. A leaked U.S. report suggests the Prime Minister told NATO allies Canada's not going to meet its spending target. What does it mean for the reputation, our commitment to NATO? That's next on The National. Welcome back to At Issue. Canada is underperforming on its NATO spending targets. A strongly worded letter from more than 60 military commanders, security officials, and politicians has called on the government to step up its defense and security efforts. A leaked U.S. report suggests the Prime Minister has told NATO allies Canada will not meet the spending target of 2% of GDP. And with the suggestion, allies are frustrated with the government's approach. It comes as NATO Secretary General is suggesting that target will be the new floor for contributions. So what does this say about the country's approach to defense and intelligence spending? Is this potentially damaging to Canada's reputation? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. Chantal, why don't you start us off on this one? I don't think it's a great surprise that Canada is not going to meet this target. It was a little surprising to me that the Prime Minister had allegedly told people this, because I'm not sure he said it that clearly publicly in this country.
Well, if he did, he was being more truthful than his predecessors. So give him some credit for speaking the truth to NATO. I don't think that anyone needed him to say it directly or indirectly to figure it out. We just talked about Volkswagen and $13 billion. No one is going to be campaigning in the next federal election to take that deal off the table. But we've had at least 2 elections in recent memory where a winning campaign plank was to say one was going to cancel a military spending contract. And that kind of tells you what the environment is, that voters in this country do not feel that spending on defense is good spending versus just about anything else. And because we keep electing minority governments, I don't think we will have a government anytime soon that says we're going to bite the bullet on this.
Except how does the fact that there is a war in Europe, Andrew, affect that thinking, I guess, in this country, and affect how a government who's not meeting that target may be viewed internationally?
I think what's clear from that Pentagon document that was released, the one that shows, or was leaked, that shows the Prime Minister saying we're never going to meet our NATO target, is that the rest of NATO are getting fed up with us. There's been a sea change in NATO attitudes that the war has certainly contributed to, but we've been falling further and further behind even before this. If you go back to 2015, we were never terribly strong, but we were about 15th out of 29 NATO countries in our spending as a percentage of GDP. We're now in 25th. We're only 4 countries behind us. So 11 countries have passed us since then, and more countries are going to pass us in the months and years to come. because yes, particularly in the European countries have looked at the situation in Ukraine, looked at the implications, and there's been a huge smartening up. Germany is going to increase to more than 2%. Other countries that had previously been lagging behind are going to get above 2%. So we're heading for, it seems to me, for a pretty rocky NATO summit this summer, where if this attitude persists in Canada, that everybody else has to be our allies, but we don't have to be theirs, I think there's less and less tolerance for it. And of course, it's not just the overall spending. It's people are looking at the dilapidated state of the Canadian military. The fact that we cannot and will not fulfill requests for us, whether it's in Haiti, whether it's earthquake relief in Turkey. People are looking at this and saying, is Canada reliable for anything? Can we depend upon them for anything? And certainly looking at the state of our military, you'd have to say no. So I agree with Chantal. The Prime Minister was at least being honest about the current political environment in Canada. I wonder how sustainable this is going to be in the long run in terms of the impacts that it has on our relationship with other countries.
Well then, and what do you do, I guess, Althea, when you get to the next NATO summit where it is expected to be on the agenda that percentage move up? Of course, it's not a requirement that you do it. It's just something they've all agreed to. But then what happens to Canada if the target goes higher?
Well, no doubt the Prime Minister will be stressing the investment that the government is making, will make in the next decade plus, actually, to come in terms of new equipment, modernizing NORAD up north. I mean, yes, it's great that he can speak candidly to allies and that he is at least forthright. I guess I would also say that if Canadians demanded it, the government would spend more. And if we had war on our continent, the government would also spend more. You look at a lot of the NATO members who upped their spending. It's because war is at their doorstep and they need to defend themselves. And clearly, if we felt such a threat, a responsible government would also up spending on military equipment and military spending. And I think a case can obviously be made that there are a lot of things that need reinvestment from even the troop numbers, the fact that we have a really hard time actually getting members to join the Canadian Forces and keeping them, down to our very old submarines, or used also submarines, to labs, like everything. But it's because people want childcare and dental care, and that's why the government's not spending on it.
Chantal.
I feel like I'm experiencing déjà vu. It seems we've been having panels where all this was being said after 9/11, with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and ISIS, and now with the obvious threat from not only Russia, but also probably China's ambitions. And here we are, 20 years on, and I am not hearing from any of the parties that are not the government in the House of Commons, including the Conservatives, anything really different from what I'm hearing from the government. So I agree with Althea, and that was my point. Canadian voters are not demanding it. And as long as they don't, especially if we're going to continue electing minority governments, no government is going to go down that road.
Last word to you, Andrew.
At some point, leaders have to lead, particularly on issues as vital as national security. What may finally smart us up is we've got this vast expanse of the North that we simply basically leave undefended. At some point, maybe not in that far future, Russia or China or some other power is going to start challenging us up there, and I don't know what we're going to do at that point.
Okay, got to leave it there. Thank you all. Good to see you this week. And with that, I'll send things back to Ian in Vancouver.
Thanks, Rosie. Coming up, a little bit of White House karaoke.
A long, long time ago.
South Korea's president belts out an American classic in our moment.
Music used to make me smile.
The South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol, stole the show last night, giving a surprise rendition of American Pie at a swanky state dinner hosted by the president at the White House. The audience was impressed, rising to their feet for a standing ovation. The rare display of world leader karaoke has got to be our moment.
A long, long time ago.
So I was there in the room. It was in the state dining room of the White House.
Well, we wanted to hear you sing it.
President Yoon kind of demurred, pretended like he wasn't going to do it, but he got up there and he did it.
A long, long time ago, I can still remember how that music used to make me smile. And now I knew if I had my chains, that I could make those people dance, and maybe they'd be happy for a while.
You could hear people in the crowd, even as he was singing, saying, wow, wow, wow.
The music died.
President Yoon really stole the show. People were just blown away. He got a tremendous ovation. It was really an amazing display for everyone at the event.
Okay, so that was fantastic. I don't want to take away from it, but that little bit at the beginning, kind of looking reluctant. We all have our karaoke songs. We all know we can nail them. That clearly was his, but good for him for doing it. Andrew, our producer on this, sent me the lyrics to the song with the notation in case I would like to sing. I will not subject you to that. But I will say that that is the National for April 27th. Have a good night.